So our recording is started. So those of you who, I know there are often people who register and aren't able to participate at this particular time, but who want to be able to view it later. So you will all get a notice when the recording is available. As I mentioned, you can download the slides. We will also send a link to them as a follow-up to our session today. So if you're listening to this and don't have time to copy this link down, you can just email us, just brainware@mybrainware.com, and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the slides. Finally, a number of people, I believe, have requested a certificate of participation, and that will get to you automatically if you have. If you're watching this as a recording, again, you can just email us, brainware@mybrainware.com, and request a certificate of participation. So just before I introduced our speaker, we would like to get a little just idea of who we have on the webinar today. So if you would sort of tell us a little bit just who you are, that would be great. I've launched a poll and you should be able to see it. So feel free to click on the one that best describes you. We all often play multiple roles, but this is first choice. Okay, so it looks like we're about 40% educational leaders and administrators, about 40% consultants and researchers, and we have a parent. So that will be a nice blend of perspectives, I think. Actually, a lot of, even some more consultants and researchers. So I'm sharing the results so that everybody can see it. And what I want to do now is to introduce our presenter today. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that he can share his. So today we have with us Bondo Nyembwe, who is Executive Director at Academia Cesar Chavez in St. Paul, Minnesota. I can tell you, while his bio reads this, it doesn't even give him enough credit, which is he is a really passionate educator. He's worked as a principal executive director for 15 years in urban schools in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. He is dedicated to school transformation and pretty darn good at it. So focusing on creating common practices for school culture, for teaching and for learning. He believes that scholars' achievement for all is really a moral imperative, and I know that he's going to talk about that today. He loves reading and translating research into practice to transform schools, particularly when it has to do with neuroscience and education and how neuroscience can inform our practices. He authored an article in educationnews.org, Teachers of Color Face Shortage, What Does It Mean to Our Growing Number of Minority Students? Bondo grew up in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He came to the US at the age of 15. He has 2 undergraduate degrees and a graduate degree, all from the University of Minnesota, and has spent time in immersive study of Spanish language and culture, and of course, also educational leadership. He's married and he has 5 children, so he has ample opportunity to practice his theories, both in school and at home. I don't think he ever probably gets away from teaching and guiding. So Bondo is also a dear friend, which I'm happy to say, and I'm just so excited to have you here today with us and look forward to what you have to tell us.
Good morning. As we say at our school, buenos dias, because 90% of our scholars are Hispanics. And so before I start, let me say this. I think that all of you logged in today, it's because you're interested to hear the story. And there is a story to be told, which I will share with you with qualitative and quantitative data. And then my goal is to speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions. So in order to do that, I'm gonna set my reminder so that we get to that objective, because I think it's meaningless for me to talk and not give you time to ask questions. So I am set for 45 minutes. And so in Betsy's introduction, and thank you, Betsy, for that, she stated that I believe that it's a moral imperative that we transform our schools. I believe that, and it's a principle that I live by because my children go to a school where they're successful. And it is the responsibility of every educator and school administrator, superintendent, to make sure that the schools that we run are schools where we want our children, our own children, to attend and be successful. And I say that because we can also flip it and make it an economic imperative. An economic imperative means, so if we do a good job educating children, they are able to learn, read, write, and do arithmetic, go on to the trades or to college, get a good job and become productive citizens of the community. They will pay their taxes. You and I can retire. And that's an economic imperative. So we benefit and they benefit. The inverse may have catastrophic outcomes if we don't do a good job educating them. There is a lot more that can be said that we will not all benefit from. And that's why I am excited about school transformation. I've completed one. I'm in a second school where we're restarting the process. And in some future years, I will be able to share those results as well. So we have a couple objectives. Let's see, how do I move my slides?
You may be able to use the arrow key on your keyboard.
Arrow key. No, that's not working.
All right, and then make sure to click on the screen on the PowerPoint itself.
All right, now there we go. Excellent.
Okay.
So our objectives for today's are as follow. You will be able to adequately describe the pillars for learning. You will be able to adequately describe the 3 adult actions that lead to school transformation. And you will be able to adequately identify the outcomes of school transformation. And so the picture you see before me is a picture of when I was a principal at St. Paul City School. And every year we had Spirit Week. And during Spirit Week, you have scholars who dress up because one of those days was Dress for Success. And all these beautiful children you see here dressed up like the principal, and they wanted to be a principal someday. That gave me great joy, and I always tell this story because as a principal, children are watching every move that you make. And I'm grateful that these little children were able to identify some good characteristic in me that they wanted to emulate in their future endeavors. And there is a quote that I share with you here. It says, those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt the person doing it. And this is a Chinese proverb. The picture you see before you clearly gives you 2 feelings. Well, I don't think a person can walk on the periphery of a bag. And some of you are saying, this is possible because the truth really lies beyond what you cannot see. In this basket, there is probably a rock at the bottom or a piece of metal that's holding it so sturdy that this person can walk around. That's a logical reason to be able to say we have to look beyond what we see and imagine the unthinkable when we know that our actions may lead to it. And so this is a great quote that gives a great picture of what school transformation is. You have some thoughts, some ideas of what the school can be. You've looked at the research, and you don't know yet if it can happen in your school, but there are plenty of examples from other schools that have proven it to be a success. And so all you have to do is engage in the process. And so let's talk about some myths, because there is a lot of myths that come when we think of school transformation. The first one is that, especially for urban schools, we say, urban schools are difficult to transform. And the reason being many of the issues that we see. teachers constantly putting fires, classroom management concerns, children come from impoverished environments, or children speak English as their second language, or the list goes on. And there's another one is that, you know, poverty is really an impediment to success. And we know that's not true because, you know, some people say DNA is not your destiny, right? So wherever you were born doesn't determine your outcome of your life. And so children from poverty bring a lot of assets into our schools. You just have to look at them and figure them out by asking and engaging in dialogue. And the third one is that, you know, if only they came from a two-parent home, or if only we can do something better with their parents to help them understand the value of education, then we can transform the school. And there are lots more myths that go on, which are just myths, as we say it. So what gets in the way is perhaps one question worth investigating. In many schools, time to reflect is a factor. Teachers, educators, administrators in many places do not take the time to reflect. In other words, look back, think about the present, and think forward. What can we do? Reflection time doesn't happen. In many schools, again, we see that people don't find allies. There are exemplar teachers, exemplar schools that have a story of success that if we look, we ask questions, we may start seeing the possibilities before us. And in other places, in other schools, we just don't master the courage to change. We see the problem, we know there is a problem, and we're satisfied with it. One of the challenges that gets in the way is that many educators know their research, they know what it says, but they don't understand what to do. And that is very, very disturbing because while they know the reality, they just don't understand what to do. And that's the difference between knowing and understanding, which are not synonymous. There is also this belief factor, right? We need to believe that our schools can be transformed, whether it's a low-performing school, average performing school, or one that just have a few problems. Any school can be transformed. And finally, not taking action is the cause of the achievement gap in many schools. All right, so let's talk about school transformation then. There is a quote here that says, our education system was never designed to deliver the kind of results we now need to equip our scholars for today's world and tomorrow's. The system was originally created for a very different world. We need to rethink and redesign the learning environment. So every educator has to look at his school, their school, and say, how are we meeting the needs of the children here? And be able to improve whatever needs to be done so that scholars continue to be successful. Here's the profile of the school that I worked at, St. Paul City School. 460 students, 96% of them on free and reduced price lunch, 58% learning English as their second language or third or fourth. 98% of them were students of color. And here's the beauty, 1/3 Black, 1/3 Latinos, and 1/3 Hmong. How precious. And you will see some of the data that I show you. So the results are as follow. In terms of reading proficiency at grade level, in 2012 and 13, you can see that in the red there, red emergency means 2 or more grades below grade level. Yellow means 1 grade below grade level. And green means at or above grade level. So in 2012 and 13, half of the school was in emergency mode. And only 31% of them were reading at or above grade level. And look quickly in 2015-16, that 48% dropped down to 18.2%. And we now had 60% of the scholars reading at or above grade level. So this is a recipe for success. And as I go on, I'll talk about the focus and what we did to get these results. I'm a big fanatic of literacy because I believe that in part, the problems we see in many schools that are not succeeding or low performing or underperforming, it's because children don't read enough. Literacy is not the core of what the school does. When you think of any assessment that is given, the number one requisite or prerequisite is that children are able to understand what they read before they answer the questions that are being asked. And so in a school like this in 2012-13, when half of the school cannot read on grade level and the state assessment is on grade level, you already know what the outcomes are. And so in order to change that, you need to do something about literacy, the way teachers teach, what behavior students do, and what you actually do to help them acquire volume reading and become avid readers. And so these are the results, and is some growth data. If you look, each year we average almost 1 year of growth. That's the bottom green data that you see there in 13, 14, 15, and 16. Every year there was growth. What we do is we do daily reading. We expect our scholars to read 30 minutes in school and 30 minutes at home. And so these average steps, it's one step is 15 minutes of reading, 2 steps is 30 minutes. So every day in our school, these children from the demographic I showed you were reading for an hour a day, and some of them more and some of them less. That's why when you look at the percentage of daily reading average, in 2013 it was 74, in 2014 it was 72, and then in 15 and 16 it went up. You can see that progress doesn't happen overnight, but progress happens when you measure your activities. When you measure what you are doing, you're able to see whether you're progressing or not progressing. So here are some more data that are interesting to all of us who are in this webinar today. Suspension rate went down when we look at September 2013 to January 2014. So basically the same year, 1 year later, we went from 51, we went down to 51 suspension. And when you look at 2014 to 2015, we went from 51 literally to 6 suspensions. And you're going to ask the question why, and I'll tell you later. Bus referrals, 1,100 to 100 referrals in 1 year. We had about 13 buses. In-school fights, this is at the middle school. 2011-12, 3 fights every week. And in 2014, only 5 fights per year. The change is that those 5 fights were new students who came into our system. Anybody who had been part of our school system in the transformation years were used to the new culture, and that's why we were down to 5 fights in 2014. And look at the academic data now. Our middle school in Minnesota, they do this thing called, they used to do rating schools. And so we were on our focus rating, we were at 9.75. And 4 years later, we had moved up to 44.46. And the fifth year, we're at 63% in terms of where the school was rating. Look at the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment for Reading. In 2014-15, looking at 7th grade, literally doubled in 1 year. And when you look at 8th grade, they went from 4% to 25%. This is just in 1 year. And look at the math, 7th grade from 21 to 35, and then look at 8th grade from 33 to 50. And this speaks to the power of teachers. When teachers teach with fidelity and are really focused on explicit instruction. So I show you this data to tell you that That's what we were able to achieve. We're still making some progress, but now let me give you some details about what we did. So actions. I think Betsy, we're ready for the next poll here. Betsy, are you on?
Yes, sorry, I had muted myself. So I am going to relaunch polling. Okay, continue. All right, now I want to get, no, I don't want that poll. Oh, here's the poll of what. Okay, so I'm going to launch this. And it has to do with what everybody thinks is the first step that's necessary to transforming a school. And so Bondo provided 4 alternatives here: changing the adults, changing the students, finding more money, and hiring new teachers. I think I'd be tempted to try to check all 4, but we're definitely getting a trend here. Okay, Bondo, so what we're seeing is that over 80% of our audience today says we need to start by changing the adults' behaviors, and the remaining less than 20% said changing the students' behaviors. So I'm going to end that poll, and I'll share the results so everybody can see. But that's the opinion of what you've got in the audience today. So now you can tell us what your experience is.
Excellent. You know, the audience, just like in Deal or No Deal or Do You Want to Be a Millionaire, whenever you go to the audience, you always get the right answer. The audience has answered correctly. The number 1 step into transforming a school is changing the adults' behaviors, because the adults lead the culture by setting high expectation, which is then supported or guided by the school leader, principal, or assistant principal. You know, Pedro Noguera say this: I bring you good news, I bring you great news, there is nothing wrong with the children. So when you think of any school, when you're wondering what's happening in the school, the first question is to say, are children attending school? And so if children are coming to school every day, the question is, what are we doing with them? Academically, behaviorally, to enable them to give them a great personal experience. What are we doing about our climate, our environment in the school to ensure that they are succeeding? So more money is never the solution, because I can give you an example of, well, actually, let me tell you of one. If you go back to the school improvement grant, there was actually a study done by the Fordman Foundation, and here's what they found out. Jean-Claude Brizard was the author of the study. Schools receive anywhere from 2 million to 3 million annually for 3 years, and here was the data. 1/3 of the school got worse than what they were. 1/3 of the school stayed the same, and the other 1/3 of the school only had single-digit improvement in their achievement. So this is 2 to 3 million annually. So do the math, 9 million in 3 years, and the results were no better, right? So finding more money is not the answer, but rather changing what adults do. And I'm going to show you more example of what we did in our school. So the reality, right? It's very simple. When I talk about adult behavior, number 1, it's about belief. You need to believe that your school can be transformed. That's first. Some people say seeing is believing. I say believe first that there are possibilities, and you'll see it happen. If you look around, you have examples of schools or teachers who have demonstrated that. Language. Language is very important. I'll show you later a book as a resource for you to look into. By Peter Johnston. I think it's called Choice Words is the book. You'll see it later on. Language, you know, in schools, if we're serious about improving the environment and meeting the social emotional learning needs of the children, our language needs to change. So we need to avoid saying no, but, or however. We have to use the word and. I see that these scholars are struggling and we need to find a solution. Rather than, well, I see these scholars struggling, but they're always acting that way. You see, when you use the word and, you have to think of a positive solution. You have to think of framing things differently so that you can find an ally or a solution to the problem. And the third one is taking action. Whenever in schools you see something, instead of being a person who complains about it, or if you go in the teacher's lounge, you probably want to change the narrative of what people say. And in terms of action, what we do or believe is that we need to develop structures within our schools. We need to support our teachers and other staff, and we need to measure the progress of what we do. So in other words, we implement actions, we go deep on those actions, and we sustain those actions. One of the principles that I learned from a friend of mine, he says, we attack, we attempt, and we adopt. Attack, attempt, and adopt. What you see in many schools is they attack, they attempt, and they abandon. That's why they never get to see a brighter day ahead of time, because they didn't stay enough with those strategies or practices that makes a difference. So there are prerequisites to school transformation. And the first one that is so key to this work is recruiting a conscientious leader who can cultivate and nurture others. I think Paulo Freire talks about the process of conscientization. It simply means that we need to be reflective about what we do and be able to ask the right questions so that we can focus on the better outcomes. And number two, every school that wants to be transformed needs to adopt one focus. I'm serious about this. What you have in many schools is what you call the adoption fatigue. There is strategies after strategies or programs after programs that get implemented and they change every year. Unfortunately, you know, in some of these schools, especially low-income schools, is that they see leaders come and go, teachers come and go. So whatever was adopted, well-intentioned, never took roots, because the next new leader who came with is new and better. And who's suffering? It's the scholars who are suffering. A third prerequisite, as I stated before, is you need to realize that more money is not the solution to the problem. Repurposing existing funds to meet the dire needs that are within the school or the district actually gives you more leverage. On the slide that I showed earlier in terms of the schools, I said there are 460 scholars. What actually happens is we started with 330. As we got better at what we're doing, more scholars came in and we had more money to meet their needs, because, you know, the state still pays you to educate those children. And finally, it's dedicating time to do the work. In every school that I go into, or when I talk to educators and administrators, there is always this issue of time. Oh, we don't have time for this, or we don't have time for this, or there is never enough time. My advice is this: we need to make time. We need to think about how we're using our time and look at the schedule and be able to create opportunities where we can focus on the main thing. You know, 20 years ago, those who were master scheduler, if you were to go to a master scheduler in a school and say, can we do this? They will say, no, we cannot do that. And that was their answers. The reality is, in the past 7, 10 years, every master scheduler will say this to you: yes, we can do whatever you're asking, provided that you are willing to take the trade-offs. So in order to create time, there is this shift, give to get. Something has to go so that something else can take place. And these are the prerequisites to school transformation. So it is also important to have a working definition of what school transformation is, because there is what it's not. So school transformation is about improving the school external structure, meaning what are we doing to work with the community so that we can support the children? What partnership can we create so that we're not taxing our teachers with more and more things on their plates rather than having them focus on instruction? We also have to improve the internal structure. By internal structure, these are your processes: school culture, school climate. When you walk into a classroom, what type of professional development are we giving teachers? What strategies are we sharing with teachers that they need to use because they're research-based, evidence-based, and are we giving them time to learn and get better at it? There is also redesigning the learning experience of learner. By this is engaging in those social, emotional learning experiences to know what the children can do, what they have yet to learn, and how we can help them see a better hope for the future. This may include, having our scholars helping with cleaning the school and keeping it clean. At the end of the day, rearranging the desk in the classroom, picking up the paper off the floor, teaching them these soft skills that are so important for now and the future. And then we also have to empower teachers to know and understand what good teaching is. I cannot emphasize enough the know and the understand. And there is a lot that we can talk about empowering teachers to understand what good teaching is and how to use a few strategies that work well, right? Reciprocal teaching is one. The gradual release of responsibility is one. And there are more strategies that we can. But can we teach those, go observe the classrooms and see the teachers incorporating them? And then finally, part of this working definition of school transformation is measuring the progress of both the teachers and the learners relative to their starting point and continue to grow. Because many times people interpret school transformation as a school that went from being at the bottom 5% of schools in their state or their county to becoming way at the top at the 90 percentile or 70 percentile. What you need to realize is progress happens over time. You can be at bottom 5, you become bottom 25, then you become in the middle 50, and then 60. That's part of that progress, because if you're at the bottom, there is only one way to go up. And up is measuring the progress relative to where you started to where you're going. And once you change the experiences to where a school where scholars were not able to read even for 10 minutes, and now they start reading for an hour a day, that's transformative. Because once they've learned how to read, that will never be taken away from them unless they have a traumatic brain damage or experience, then it's gone. But the minute they know how to read, that means they know how to find the information, where to find it, and they can read it because they know the importance of that. And that's a transforming process that is essential to understanding this work, because it's not easy. It is hard, but it's possible, provided that you take the time. So why is this work important? Because we're preparing tomorrow's leaders. Earlier on, we talked about the economic imperative. We're also enriching and sustaining communities. This is not about transplanting children from a low-income neighborhood so that they can go to suburban schools where they can learn. This is within their own communities to transform the schools so they can see that it can be done and we can improve the conditions within our community and have successful schools. And finally, it's this idea of valuing the local context. They need to know that they're okay where they are. We don't need to put them in a different neighborhood. They can grow in their neighborhood. They can start influencing the neighborhood by participating in service learning projects. And that is big, because now we're talking about transforming the community. And a good place to look is to see the work of Jeffrey Canada in the Children Ireland Zone, which is also being replicated in many places around the country. So, adult actions. When it comes to school transformation, number one is learning. What Are the adults willing to learn, making time to learn so that they can change their own culture of learning? Number two, improving instruction. Explicit instruction is by far the number one thing that teachers can do to improve and change the dynamic within a school environment by being methodical about how they teach, talking less, and having scholars participate, having dialogue so that scholars are given time to think critically, to explain their own thinking and judgment, and to come to some conclusion by looking at real world experiences. And all that is part of having good and explicit instruction. So if you do those two things, the third action is, how do you know it's actually working? And you have to measure the progress. Not at the end of the term, daily by doing exit tickets, weekly by doing an assessment that's cumulative of the standard or the standard that you covered that week. And then 7 weeks later, do an interim assessment. So both formative and summative assessment are essential, but the most important ones are formative assessments that are conducted daily and weekly. And many of these should not be given a grade, because every time you give a grade to an assessment, you put children, you cause them anxiety. So if they're called formative assessment, they are to inform your instruction so that you as a teacher can learn and get better. And you can give feedback to the scholars immediately so they can improve their own practice. So these are the three adult actions that are required to transform a school: learning, improving instruction, and measuring the progress on all fronts. So it is true that teachers are essential to the process of school transformation, but there is no great school without a great leader. You do need a conscientious leader who know what the problem is, who understand what the problem is, and how to address the problem by working collaboratively with all the people who work in the institution that we call school. So, John Quincy Adams said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. I cross leader, I say you are a teacher, because this can be interchangeably, because teachers do this same thing in a classroom, and leaders do this same thing in a school setting. So, question, we're ready for another poll, Betsy. Can we?
Okay, we sure can. Okay, so stop and share results. And now I want to go to why schools fail. Because as you pointed out, particularly when you were talking about the school improvement grants and how so many were not successful, this will get at and get everybody's opinion as to why many schools continue to fail despite all of the research and all of the evidence of successful school turnarounds. All right, so we're getting a number of responses now. And we have one predominant response. Okay, we just give everybody another couple of seconds to enter their responses if they want to. Okay, so we're still getting a couple of responses here. All right, 2/3, Bondo, of the group today said all of the above. No one said just lack of moral imperative. Almost 1/3 said not committing time to take action. And there was one person who said lack of understanding of how to improve. But most of the responses, or the predominant response, was all of the above.
Excellent. You know, the audience is not wrong this time again. They've got it in right. And you know, this means two things. Either I'm a good teacher and it's a reflection of what I'm sharing, or they were just gifted, like God has blessed all of us with the ability to learn. And so I am glad that most of you believe that it's all of the above, and you are correct, because if you don't understand how to improve, it's difficult to actually take action. If you don't commit time to think about what to do and then to do it, you'll never get there. And that lack of moral imperative is that sense of urgency. If you lack it, then there is nothing you're going to do to change what's happening in your school. So let's keep going here. So this is what we call the pillars for learning. We didn't, start at St. Paul City School with this in mind. What we started with was many of the things that I described earlier. And 3 years later, I was sitting down and I thought, so what have we been doing for 3 years? And I was able to come up with this diagram that you have here. Basically, the pillars for learning are summarized as focused professional learning community. For those of you who do learning teams or PLC, it's everything you know, left and right, upside down, east to west, doing it best of its kind, right? Looking at scholars' work, purposeful planning, designing assessment, reviewing and responding to data, and meeting weekly and having an agenda that you follow. So all those things that you know. Secondly, it's about developing common practices. And on this second pillar, it's both instructional practices, what teachers will do every day, 100% of the time, to deliver explicit instruction. And then there are behavioral practices. And these are not how to behave in school as in discipline, but rather scholarly behavior. Taking notes, knowing how to respond, working with others, so collaboration, and showing up on time and ready with your pen and notebook. So all these behaviors that leads to focused learning from the scholars. And in Lisa's Delpit's words, she says, many times in schools, we expect children to learn middle-class values, but we never teach it to them. So in our school, we had to teach our scholars what we expected from them so that there was no excuse. And the reason for having these common practices, imagine if in first grade, second grade, third grade, every grade that they go in, we have school-wide practices, expectations that are followed. And that means in second grade, the teacher has to review but not reteach those expectations. And these expectations were set for everyone in the school. Everybody knew that you have to walk quietly, you have to tuck in your shirt, you have to walk and not run in the hallway. And inside the classroom, we have a board configuration. There's a place for homework. There's a place for the content and language objectives. There's a place for, imagine every expectation that you can have into a classroom. So our scholars had less and less to relearn every year because they knew the expectation. And of course, we have interim assessments. The school culture was sound. We celebrated. We did all these great things. So common practices so that one teacher is not pit against another by students. All the teachers were setting high expectations and enforcing them. And finally, the third pillar. So if you do 1 and 2, now you need to know that whatever you're doing is working. So I call this the money pillar because this is where we coach and evaluate, we observe classroom, we give feedback. In our school, teachers received 25 to 30 observations before the end of the year. So weekly, some teachers got 2 observations, some teachers got 1 observation. And the feedback was immediately given within 24 to 48 hours so that that information is clear, it's not forgotten, it's still fresh in their mind. And so this is what we describe as the pillars for learning. And of course, we had a teacher evaluation process, but that came in last. After we've developed teachers, after we've supported them, then we decided to evaluate them. We don't evaluate before we develop them. And by developing them is in August, we have 2 weeks of professional development where we teach them these instructional practices and then they role play, whether they're classroom management strategies or instructional practices, and they work with their teams. And then we go see them in their classroom to see how they're doing. We give them feedback, then we evaluate. So that's the process that we take. And so because we have the pillars for learning, we also have a process for learning. And the process for learning is professional development, learning, and then teaching. You cannot expect teachers to teach with fidelity before you've given them time to learn, or you cannot expect them to teach, implement strategies without giving them the right professional development. And in terms of professional development, we have what we call structured and autonomous. The structured professional development is what everybody gets, and the autonomous is what it's the a la carte. Those who need to learn about EL strategies, those who need to do better on classroom management, those who need to do better on writing assessment. So each teacher has a professional development plan, and that is aligned with the professional development, personal development plan that is aligned with the professional development. And so this is what we call the process for learning. So there is the pillars for learning, and then there is a process for how we ensure that learning happens. In the middle here, you see the learning. The W means, I have actually a key on the bottom, which shows you what happens when, daily, weekly, monthly, and so on. And so as I said, I am watching my time. I have 3 minutes, and we'll be at 45 minutes. Then I can give you an opportunity to ask questions. So the quality of instruction is essential to focus on during the transformational process, because the quality of teachers is the single most important factor in the educational system. That's what Williams said in 2012. I paraphrase this a little by saying the quality of teaching is the single most important factor in the educational system. So the goal is to grow a group of teachers, but the focus is on their teaching. That's why we observe frequently, to be able to plan and give feedback to teachers. Because when you improve teaching within a system, you improve the outcome of that system, as we've seen. So the responsibilities of a leader within a school that's being transformed is one that must be focused on building capacity. That means who are the second tier of leaders within the school. So these are your PLC leads. These are your coaches, so that we are growing the number of people who can assist in the observation and feedback, so that the principal is not the only person doing it. Secondly, the principal needs to focus on growing groups of teachers. So some of you call these PLCs, we call them learning team in our schools. So allowing teachers to learn together in a group as adults. And this is how you get to changing the adult behaviors. Yes, you do give them some things that they need to work on. And then as you progress, you allow them to engage in the process of deep learning. This is the work of Michael Fullan. How are they on their own choosing an area to focus on because they see a need within their grades? And when you allow adults and give them the structure in which to work and collaborate, they do a great job. And another component is to continue to support teacher leaders. So it's one thing to put teachers in leadership capacity, but it's also equally important to provide professional development for them so that they can renew and continue to learn and grow. This is the work of Jim Knight at the University of Kansas with the coaching, the impact coaching cycle. So these are some of the things that you do to support your teacher leaders in order to develop them. And finally, you develop the capacity in scholars. So these are your students. When you focus on those behavioral practices, they are able to develop and become servants in your school, leaders, servant leaders, I should say, and be able to show others how to do it and do it well. So being capable is a requirement of a leader. So when you look at the picture on the left, we rewarded our scholars with medals when they read, when they got 100 steps and 200 and 300. So by the end of the year, every year in our school, most of our scholars were reading 250 hours or more. So the floor was 250. The ceiling was however long they could go. So, and the picture on the right, you know, Math, reading, writing is okay, but allowing them to think critically through play like chess or checkers and other games is essential. Ping pong, so they can develop hand-eye coordination, patience, self-control, collaboration. Through games, you can help them develop those skills. And that's also essentially school that's being transformed because the brain gets tired, right? It's plastic, it's malleable, but you want to engage it in different way. And a leader needs to be committed, right, to learning. So not only are you supporting your people to learn, but you're also learning. You can see I'm in the middle there with other principals from some charter and St. Paul public schools, where we were in a core, the PLC of principal. And at the time we had Jim Knight who came to work with us. And then on the right side, you have a teacher who's doing a small group, focusing on what matters most, teaching in a small group to be able to address, the interventions and needs of scholars. So in terms of research, there is a great book out there by Daniel Willingham called Why Don't Students Like School? My recommendation is every educator and teacher needs to read this book because it will change the way you look at school and how you engage children. And of course, if you're interested in formative assessment, Dylan William has a great book called Embedded Formative Assessment. And so you can learn how to do those things. So outcomes, you have some more outcomes, and then I will be ready for your questions. Outcome data, scholars become avid readers. Some behavioral data, scholars learn how to play chess. Some more outcome data in terms of results, increased sense of fulfillment. So 93% of our scholars were saying they were completely satisfied year after year. Increased learning opportunity for adults to develop their practice. Our teachers were averaging over 160 hours of learning, not including PLCs. So if we had to include the PLC, which they met for an hour every Thursday, so multiply that by the number of weeks we have in school, they were learning. And when adults learn, they change their own practice, they improve scholars' outcome, the school culture improves, the school climate improves. Scholars' impact, increased participation after school programs. So we had 120, went to 200, but it wasn't academic only. We diversified it to meet their needs and make it fun and engaging with some enriching activities. But those who needed the academics, we still gave it to them. Increased reading proficiency in 1 year. So for 90% of our scholars, as you saw earlier, every year they were reading. Every year they were reading. And so the results are showing for themselves. Immediate results that you can expect during a school transformation process, year to year, it's improvement in learning of the instructional delivery, right? So you go from 18% to 60% of your scholars are reading on grade level because teachers are doing a great job teaching. They understand. One of our goals was to say, let's focus on balanced literacy. So our teachers, we're teaching them to become teachers of literacy. Whether you taught science or social studies, you needed to know and understand the complexity of reading and writing so that you can include it in your class. And so if the science teacher, the social studies teacher are incorporating reading and writing, they're developing vocabulary in their classes. We're helping our scholars to get better at literacy. Increased teacher retention. Over 3 years, we went 60%, 84%, and 92%. People think that in a school like this, teachers will be quitting every day. They love what they did. They were teaching. They were not putting out fires because behaviors was not a problem. And they loved it and they stayed there. Increase enrollment, as I said earlier, from 330 to 460. Decrease in behaviors. You saw my behavior data earlier on. Decrease in office referrals and increase in scholars' independence and ownership. They own their learning. They became the master of their learning. You could walk in any classroom and ask them, what are you working on? And they can tell you. You can ask them, what is your reading proficiency score? And what does that mean? They can tell you what it means. And you can ask them, what are you supposed to do to get to the next level? They can explain to you the activities that they needed to do to grow and learn in academic language. And finally, there is increased parent satisfaction, 97, 90, 98%. And when parents are happy, they tell others about your school and your school just start getting full. And so these are the immediate results. Some recommended books that I read in the process: Leverage Leadership. There is now a Leverage Leadership 2.0. I actually attended a training on it last week. Choice Words by Peter Johnston. So if you want to change the language of adults and educators, this book gives you the research behind the meaning of words and the power of words. And of course, nowadays we have everybody's trying to make their school equitable. So there is Cultural Responsive Teaching and the Brain. Very good book because it starts with the brain. Because in many instances, we focus on the problem, which we have, needs in our schools, but knowing that we have a brain, red blood, there is a lot that we can do because that's the solution. If teachers understand the neuroscience or the plasticity of the brain, it helps them see possibilities and how children can improve. So I'm going to stop here and take any questions.
Great. So we did have a question along the way. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, just type them into the chat window and we will convey those to Bondo. So one of the questions that came up had to do with who does the teacher observation. And it sounds like that may have evolved over time. So maybe you can talk about where you started and how you built capacity around that.
Excellent. So in our school, so I was the principal at the time, and we had an assistant principal, and then we had a literacy coach. So we had 3 people who were given the task of conducting observations. And so the schools were actually split. Pre-K through 5 was in one building, and 6 through 8 was in another building. So one day I was doing observation in the elementary school. The assistant principal was doing observation in the middle school. And the curriculum coordinator, who was also one of the literacy coach, would float wherever based on need. And so daily we were committed to do 3 to 4 observations. That was the most important thing that we did in the school. And Paul Bembrick's employer says it in Leverage Leadership. If the most important thing of an administrator or a principal is to observe instruction, if you're not observing instruction, you're not doing your job. So we did that, we did our job, and the results are showing. Over time, we realized that we couldn't sustain this, and so we started growing teacher leaders. So those who led PLCs became part of it. We also hired 2 coaches, and so now the school has principal, assistant principal, curriculum coordinator, and 2 coaches. And so now we've split, so we've assigned teachers to coaches. So each coach has, anywhere from 9 to 12 teachers that they're responsible to coach so that they can focus and go deeper and deeper.
Great. Any other questions? Please make sure to type them into the chat window. Another question, because you've mentioned neuroplasticity and you've talked about the brain a little bit. Can you talk about any particular initiatives you have that you've incorporated in your school based on your knowledge of I mean, it certainly is part of your PD, but is there anything else you'd like to share with the group today?
Yeah, one of the things that we did is we recognized that being an urban school, we had several needs that children brought with them. And of course, we had teachers who were not sure if this can be done. And so what we did is we used the research from ACE, Adverse Child Experiences, and we created a presentation where we show teachers the reality of the ACE and what it means and the effect it has. And we called it the problem. And then we took the information of what we know about the brain and neuroplasticity that we've learned over the years, and we called that the solution. So we talked about the way the brain works during reading, the physiology of the brain, the connection of the brain. So literally describing for teachers how the brain receives information and sends information out. And so that allowed them to see how to deal with children with respect to emotions, right? How do you diffuse emotion? How do you connect with children knowing what you can see as a sign? And so building the teacher's level of understanding of the functions of the brain or the reading brain and the concept of rehearsal, right? That the more you practice, the more you get better. Talking to them about the differences between short-term memory and long-term memory, explaining to them that working memory has limited capacity. So you need to chunk your information as you parent the children. And we train them on using strategies like reciprocal teaching, using stories to further embed the learning, because children receive in different modalities. And so we did a lot of those trainings that were essential for them to know and understand the impact on learning. And it has been wonderful when teachers realize how much they know. As a matter of fact, if you look at the last 10 years, any new books, whether it's ASCD or Learning Forward or all these publishers, many of them incorporate neuroscience in the beginning. I think a good example is the cultural responsive teaching and the brain. The first two chapters are talking about the brain and learning, the book by Zoreda Ahmed. And so when we inform teachers and educate them, they become well-versed and they see possibilities. The book I mentioned earlier by Daniel Willingham also talks about the process of encoding, storing, and rehearsal, the importance of practicing for the purpose of learning. And so those are some things that we've done around neuroscience to educate and grow the knowledge of our teachers.
Great. That's just very exciting to see how that's such a key part of transforming the school and changing instructional practice and interactions and engagement with students. That's really so promising an area. So we're out of time. We've used up our hour, I think, extremely productively. Bondo, you sharing your experiences, I think was, I found it fascinating. I hope that everybody else did. And if you have additional questions or didn't, I don't see any more in the chat area at this point, but if you do later, feel free to email us and we will get those questions to Bondo, and I'm sure he'll be happy to respond and to share his thinking with us. So Bondo, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who participated today. We hope to see you in another webinar sometime soon.
Thanks, Betsy. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, everybody.